welcome back to the museum's online talks. We're very grateful to the Lucy Group for sponsoring tonight. If you've ever been to the museum, you know we don't just cover the army, we try to cover all three services. And Aldon Ferguson is joining us this evening to talk about the Oxfordshire story. It's a story we've wanted to talk about for a long time, so I hope you enjoy it. If you are able, please do make a donation and also try and keep in contact with us by joining the mailing list. I hope you enjoy this evening.
Hello there and good evening. I'm David Innes, a trustee at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and I just wanted to underline something that Ursula said in her introduction just now, which is that although our title says that we are the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, we feel ourselves to be much more than this. Indeed, we feel that as we are the only military museum in the county of Oxfordshire, that we are very proud to represent all three armed services. And I hope that those of you who have managed to visit the museum will recognise this from what you've seen on your visits. This evening, we are very pleased to underline this by telling the story of the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force in the county. We have a long history of our air power in the county, and we wanted to tell you about this because of the many airfields in the county which, both in the Great War and in the Second World War, played such a large part in those two conflicts. For example, many of the aircraft that departed this country for France, for Normandy on D-Day in 1944, flew from Oxfordshire. And only last year, in 2021, the Brize Norton, Royal Air Force Brize Norton, was the focus for operations of all the Air Force, all the evacuees from Afghanistan who came back into this country. So we feel ourselves right in the thick of it from time to time. And we're delighted tonight to be able to hear this fascinating tale, thanks to Aldon Ferguson, who you're going to be meeting in a minute. Aldon is a Royal Air Force historian himself, a Royal Air Force reservist officer, and has business experience in Russia, so has an interesting perspective on the Cold War when we come to talking about that. Hope you enjoy this evening, and remember to stay with us, please, for a live Q&A immediately after Aldon finishes speaking. Aldon, over to you.
David, thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me. We have an interesting evening, I hope, and I have quite a few slides to go through to trace 110 years of military history in the county. It encompasses every generation of aviation development, from the very earliest, very flimsy biplanes right through to the most sophisticated jets that exist. The estimate of the numbers of personnel in the Air Force who were in Oxfordshire during World War II is between, I reckon, 80 and 100,000 personnel, a very, very large number. So I've got a lot to talk about, 110 years in 50 minutes or so. So I'm going to only be able to skate through the summary, and I can't go into very much detail, but hopefully it's going to throw up quite a few points of interest. It's potentially future talks on specific subjects, and I hope that it's going to be giving you a very good idea of how the Air Force has operated in the county, both the British and the American Air Force, from the beginning. And the very beginning was way back in 1911 at Port Meadow, which is immediately to the west of Oxford, as you can see on this map. The map, in fact, is a 1953 air map, hence having the names of the other airfields. There was nowhere else there in 1911. It opened as a civilian flying school and club in 1911, and the military started also very shortly afterwards, the next year, 1912 and 1913, to show an interest in Port Meadow as well. It had its ups and downs. A gale blew down all the hangars on one occasion and destroyed all the aircraft inside. And in August 1913, a fire destroyed 5 of the hangars and again virtually stopped all the civilian flying within the site. It was taken over by the military as soon as the war started and remained in Royal Flying Corps and then eventually RAF colours until the end of the First World War. Now, here are some photographs of it. The one on the right-hand side shows the River Thames as it winds round the site, and that's obviously a vertical looking down on the line of hangars, which you can see in the top left picture. Now, these hangars were timber framed, covered in canvas, a French design called Besino, and they were a standard type of hangar used very much during the First World War because they were transportable. You could pull them down, move them on somewhere else. Now, Peter Smith has written a very interesting book on Port Meadow, and these photographs are in that book. And if anybody wants more information on that, then this is the origins of aviation in Oxfordshire. Moving on to the airfields themselves, I've taken the county boundary more or less as I can understand it, as it was during World War II, because county boundaries changed. And we have some airfields which are very, very close to the border. There's one up here. We have one down here, which is Hinton in the Hedges, which are just outside. And some people may take issue about Edge Hill, which is now in Warwickshire, but at the time was in Oxfordshire. The county covers approximately 1,000 square miles, and you can see the boundaries from here. Now, the World War I airfields are marked in red on this later map, and there were very few World War I airfields. There were generally in the country, except up the east coast and in the southeast. I'm going to talk about each one briefly. Bicester, right on the border of the county. Upper Hayford, you'll be familiar with those names. Hinton in the Head, Weston on the Green, which is very close to the M40 motorway, and some of you will have seen parachutists landing there as a drop zone. Whitney, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's 2 miles to the west of Whitney town. Port Meadow, of course, which I've just mentioned. And down here, this was not an airfield, but Milton was a very important storage and packing base. I'm going to talk about that one first. This is a World War I plan of Milton. And to orientate you, the railway line here is running east-west. It's running to the east to Reading, to the west towards Swindon. The A34 road now runs up to the side of this site, and the area is now Milton Park, named obviously after the name of the village, Milton, which is immediately to the north. Railways were absolutely vital to airfields in the First World War because the road system was so poor. So here we have a major railway. We have a branch coming off it, which comes all the way up here, and then branches, sidings going in. I hope you can see on this drawing, amongst the buildings. This area here was later developed as a huge packing shed, 600 feet long, and the living accommodation was over on this side of the road and the railway. It was big in that there were, in 1918, 3,000 personnel on this base, including 1,700 women. And their main role was to support all the Royal Flying Corps stations, later to become Royal Air Force stations, not only in Oxfordshire, but in the adjoining counties as well. Very few photographs I've been able to find of it. The top one is operatively closed. It's the main entrance. The bottom one is married quarters, which were later demolished, which gave access into what is now Milton Park. On the gate is a sign saying for sale. It was a number 3 maintenance unit, and it had opened long time ago, back in 1916. And it did support all those airfields, which I've just talked about, in which I'm going to go into more detail. It stayed open. It was the only place in Oxfordshire which stayed open as an RAF base all the way through between World War I and World War II, right up to the late 60s, and it was sold in the 1970s. And in fact, some of the original buildings are still there and used for industrial purposes. So moving back to the airfields themselves, the World War I airfields, just these marked in red here, they were all very similar, and they were only open for a short period of time. They were all late during World War I, and they were all training bases. The main, as I say, operational bases were near the East Coast to protect us against the incoming airships and the potential raids from Europe. But these places did see quite a lot of activity, but no enemy action. Briefly going through them, Bicester was just a grass field, this field here. The layout is all the same on all these airfields. And you had 6 hangars, 3 pairs of 3, and one separate one there, which is a single hangar, which is called the aeroplane repair shed. Most of these were made of timber. They operated onto the grass airfield, and the living and dining site and everything was on the other side of the road. The workshops were here running up this side of the road. It opened in late 1917, late on in the war, and it was a training station. They would have 3 different training squadrons, and they would start off on the basic aircraft, and as the pilots improved and had more experience, they would move into more advanced types until eventually they were ready to go to a squadron. It was not on the list of permanent stations, and it closed in 1920. Similarly, Upper Hayford, a name which many people in Oxfordshire will be familiar with, was built in a very similar way. It had the same layout of hangars. It was a small grass airfield. Here, the accommodation was on the same side of the road, but it was about the same amount. Upper Hayford was hardly completed. The buildings were only just completed by the end of the First World War in November 1918, and it closed in 1920. Again, it wasn't on the list of permanent stations. And when this drawing was produced in 1919, there were only 51 military personnel on the base. But it did reopen, as you will be aware, and I'll cover that in a moment. It did send some aircraft to France. And here we have some SE-5As of 94 Squadron, still the Royal Flying Corps there, just a month before still the RAF then, but a month before the end of the First World War. So the squadron worked up at Upper Hayford. They trained as a squadron, then they went to France. In this particular case, the war was about to end. The other one of the others I mentioned, Weston-on-the-Green, it's a very similar layout. You can see with the hangars, and on the other side of the road, always a grass airfield. Again, it was only completed in 1918, and it was not taken up later and developed into a major airfield. It was used during World War II for training pilots and glider pilots. I'll cover that. And it is still used now as a parachute drop zone, but it was never developed anything like the other major bases we have. Whitney was similar. Whitney was on what was the A40, running east-west here, with Whitney just to the right-hand side to the east. Again, exactly the same layout of hangars. It all came off the same drawing. The other side of the road, you have the buildings. And this is typical of the buildings. It's what we call a Belfast truss hangar, because the roof trusses were a lattice of timber, and it was known as a Belfast truss. The doors folded, shutter doors, and you'll still see several of these hangars around the country. In fact, you'll see some at Duxford at the Imperial War Museum airfield in Cambridgeshire. Whitney lasted between the wars and as a civil airfield, and was probably the busiest during World War I. And in 1918, it had 848 personnel on it and 72 aircraft. How they all operated off here, I don't know. Normally, they would have a few satellite landing grounds, which would be fields in the immediate vicinity, where they could practice landing and taking off. But what they had were 36 Avro 504s, which is the picture on the top. That was a two-seat trainer specifically designed to train pilots to fly. Fairly simple aircraft, not easy to fly because it was so light, very dependent upon air and wind conditions. Once they had mastered the aircraft and they had satisfied their instructors, they would gravitate to, in this case, the Bristol fighter, and there were 36 of each of those based at Whitney. The RAF did not reoccupy it. It stayed as a civilian airfield after the First World War and during the Second World War. So by the end of the First World War, the only RAF establishment remaining active in the county was Milton. So in the period 1918 to 1939, a lot happened in terms of politics. And they realized that they needed to recover some of these airfields and to expand the Air Force to counter the threat which was coming from across the Channel. Vista had been closed in 1920, but rebuilding started in 1925, a long time before Hitler was rising in power. But we were getting concerned that we did not have an active and an efficient Air Force. So it opened in 1927, and it was comparatively small. It was still a grass airfield. It had two much more permanent hangars, this one here, they call A-type hangars. And then the major accommodation for workshops and repairs and parachutes and that type of thing, when we had them, were here, and the living accommodation was on the other side of the road. But now it's brick, it's permanent brick. And the concept here was that it would be a light bomber station. And they took some small, well, they were quite large, in fact, aircraft like this, the Overstrand from 101 Squadron. In 1934, they moved in. And by that time, they had built two new hangars in addition to the first two. A type in the background there, a much larger, what we call a C-type hangar, which could accommodate these aircraft. These were in the area of Oxford, the whole of Oxford was in the Midland bombing area. And they established many bomber squadrons in this area between the wars because they anticipated there was going to be a war coming up in the future. They moved on to much more modern types of aircraft, Blenheims and then Ansons and Oxfords and that type. But looking down on the plan of it, the hangars, these are the two C-types, the original hangars are there. And the grass airfield is really within this boundary here. But because of the threat of enemy air attack, they built dispersals into the fields some considerable distance away from the airfield. So all these, they call them frying pan dispersals. An aircraft could be parked on each one and it wouldn't be bogged down into soggy ground or anything like that in wet conditions. It grew. The living accommodation grew quite dramatically on this side of the road, and the officers' mess was located up here. So Bicester was growing in the late 20s and into the 30s, developing into a full-grown airfield by the time the war started, but it never, ever had hard runways, which really sealed its fate ultimately. Upper Hayford, the other World War I airfield, was also closed in 1920, and it was the first pre-expansion airfield to open in 1927. When I say pre-expansion, in the early 30s, starting in 32 and then accelerating more in 34, there was a series of major RAF expansion programs. They had different letters, A, B, C, ending up with L, and it got more and more urgent as the threat of war became nearer and nearer. Again, when it first opened in 1927, it only had limited hangarage, and these aircraft, of course, were the latest thing at the time, but they were slowly replaced with much more modern aircraft. So pre-World War II airfields, those were two World War I airfields which were expanded, and then we started to build them from scratch and realized we need a lot more. So Brize Norton had not been opened in World War I, but here is a plan of it. It opened in 1927 as a permanent RAF station. Again, it opened as a grass airfield, and the perimeter track was the circular area here around the grass. Then they decided they needed hard runways because of the heavier and faster aircraft. And they took the opportunity of extending the runways and the taxiway in both directions, both down here to the south and up to the north. And Brize Norton was both going to be a bomber station and a maintenance unit. And the maintenance unit had a lot of aircraft in storage. So they had these dispersals, just like at Bicester, out into the fields where they could park the aircraft, pull them in as and when they needed them into the hangars. And as we got nearer to the war, and certainly during the war, the aircraft were not parked inside the hangars because they were a target and they would be destroyed. So Brize Norton opened and became a most important airfield. Abingdon was built around the same sort of time. It opened in 1932, in fact, on the 1st of September. And again, it was a light bomber station with 3 squadrons of aircraft. It grew so big it had to have a satellite airfield at Stanton Harcourt. This is the typical A-type hangar, which was common to Bicester, Upper Heyford, and Abingdon. Also built at the same time was Harwell, a name which is now synonymous with nuclear research. And Harwell was built again as a grass airfield with this almost circular taxiway. And then once they put the hard runways down, they extended it dramatically and they built the dispersals way out into the fields so they could park the aircraft out there. This opened in 1937. Again, it was for 3 bomber squadrons, Audax, biplane, light bombers. They were replaced by battles. And when war broke out, all these bomber squadrons moved over to France. It was before the German invasion of France, and they all suffered terribly over there. These bases were then becoming empty, so they reverted to training. And the majority of the bases in Oxfordshire were used throughout World War II as training bases. Harwell, again, was a permanent base, brick buildings, workshops, brick hangars, and a brick living accommodation. If you look at the accommodation here, it's all got pitched roofs. It's all very nice pre-war, very well built and built to last. What they did find out was that the roofs were prone to incendiary bombs. If an incendiary bomb dropped onto a pitched roof and penetrated through the tiles, it would then set fire to the roof trusses and the whole building would go up. So a later expansion period airfield is determinable because it has a flat roof. It was not just because it was cheaper than putting tiles and the pitch roof up, but it meant incendiary bombs would not go through the reinforced concrete roof. So they were all permanent stations which were opened, and many of them stayed open for a long time after World War II. Kidlington, which you will know now as Oxford Airport, this opened in 1938. Again, the Woodstock Road goes right past it here, going north to south, south to Oxford, north up to Woodstock. It was opened as an elementary and refresher flying training school, and it was civilian operated by marshals of Cambridge, who are still very important in the aviation industry in Cambridge. The civil schools were teaching those who had retired from the Air Force, giving them refresher flying, ready to possibly go back into the Air Force, and elementary flying for people on a part-time basis so that they would be a cadre ready in the event of war. So in 1938, it opened. As soon as war broke out, the civilian schools closed and they were handed over to the military. Another permanent base, which I'll talk about, was Benson. And again, Benson had an almost circular taxiway until they extended the runways. You can see their new runways here. Now, this opened just before the war, April 1939. Again, it was a light bomber unit. It had 3 squadrons of light bombers, ferry battle type aircraft, and they all went over to France in 1940, where they were very badly mauled. And here the hangars are the newer type. They're all C-type hangars here. Again, the technical accommodation this side of the road. Here is the road and the main entrance coming in here. And all this side is the domestic accommodation. It was a big, still is, important base. This is a closer view of it, with just 2 of the hangars and the main entrance and the accommodation, the living accommodation on this side of the road. I have some pictures of it under construction as well. That's a steel framework for the hangars. Once the flying training schools got going, the type of aircraft which was most common was the Vickers Wellington. These were very versatile. As the war went on, they were being replaced by Lancasters and Halifaxes and this type of aircraft, but they could train pilots, navigators, engineers, gunners, all at the same time in the same aircraft, because it was a multifunction bomber. You can see obviously it had a nose turret and a tail turret as well. So the crews would operate together as a full working crew, and then once they had trained up properly on the aircraft, they would either go to a Wellington squadron or they would go across to a Lancaster or Halifax squadron. But they were twin-engined, so they were learning how to operate a more sophisticated aircraft. So during World War II, as it grew, the demand on airfields in the county grew dramatically to the point that there were 27 airfields. Now, marked on this drawing, I don't know how clearly you'll see them on your screen, but right from the top, Edge Hill, which may cause a bit of controversy because it's now in Warwickshire, but I'm well advised it was in Oxfordshire during World War II. I'll talk about that in a moment. It's the highest in the county in terms of height above the sea level, and the numbers adjacent to each of the airfield names is in fact the height above sea level. So you can see the spread, a big spread, 27 airfields plus 4 satellite landing grounds, which I haven't shown. And if you say there was an average of 2,000 people per airfield, some were higher, some were lower, that alone is 54,000 personnel. They were permanent, many of the permanent bases were Upper Heyford, Bicester, Abingdon, Benson, and Harwell. And they were all military except Cowley and Witney. Cowley just to the south of Oxford, I'll talk about, and Witney, which I mentioned earlier, which is to the the west of Witney village itself, or town as it is now. So all that many airfields, things were going to happen in Oxfordshire, and bombing was one of them. It did escape almost unharmed in comparison to the southeast of the country and the major cities. But many organisations from London hospitals and government departments moved into colleges in Oxford because they felt it was safer. London University medical students took over Keble College, Wadham and St Peter's Hall. Balliol became host of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and St John's the director of fish supplies. Hence, Oxford being called at one stage a centre of the fishing industry of the country. Not that it really was, but that's where the ministry was located. Witney itself was bombed in 1940, but there were a limited number of bombs in the county. You can see there are 3,831 bombs of all types dropped over Oxfordshire. It caused many deaths and casualties, as well as 65 head of cattle who were killed by the bombs. Over 300 houses were damaged. But on August the 16th, 1940, RAF Bryce Norton was attacked by 2 German aircraft, and they bombed the base, and they totally destroyed hangars, or destroyed all the contents of hangars 1 and 3, 2 of the big C-type hangars, and they wrecked 46 aircraft, either destroyed or written off. And it turned out to be the largest number of aircraft in one raid on one airfield in this country during the war. On the same day, Stanton Harcourt, which is just off the A40 to the east of Witney, between Witney and Oxford, that was under construction. It was also attacked on the same day, and 6 civilian workers were killed by the German attack on that. There were several other airfields were bombed. Normally, in most cases, it was after they'd been completed. But Kidlington, Barford St John and Watchfield were all bombed by the enemy. There were very few V1s landing in the county. It's, I'm told, only 4 actually landed in Oxfordshire. But the other problem was it was a very busy training area. So at night, when they were training the pilots to fly, night flying, the flower path and the area around the airfield would be illuminated. And on some occasions, enemy fighters came in and shot down our training aircraft as they were coming into land or flying in the circuits. That happened on quite a few of these bases. So we did suffer in Oxfordshire quite considerably from enemy activity, but nothing like London or the southeast. There were two civilian areas. Cowley was Morris Motors. It was the large factory which Lord Nuffield owned, and it became #1 civilian repair unit, specifically working on Spitfires and Hurricanes, repairing them. The most important thing about the Battle of Britain was that it was fought over Britain, in that if our aircraft were damaged and had to crash land or force land, they were recoverable and they could be repaired. And it was places like this that repaired them. If a German aircraft crashed over Britain during the Battle of Britain, they lost it forever. They were never going to get it back. And that was one of the factors for helping us win the Battle of Britain. The other thing they did here is they built Tiger Moths. And did they build them? They built 3,210 Tiger Moths in these hangars here. And Tiger Moths were used for training. They were the biplane trainer. It had 2 grass runways, which were laid in front of the main plant. Of course, now it's the mini plant, and there's no way you'd get a runway or an aircraft near it, but it played a very important part in World War II. Moving on now to people, there were some famous people who came from Oxfordshire or moved into Oxfordshire or travelled through it. And here are 3 examples of pupils from Sir Edward's School in Oxford. On the left, we have Guy Gibson, who was the commanding officer of 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. Top right there, we have Douglas Bader, who was a famous fighter pilot with no legs, who was shot down and created so many problems in Colditz, and then survived the war, unlike either of the other 2, unfortunately, and continued to fly after the war, and then with Shell Aviation. And the bottom one is Adrian Warburton, who was also at St Edward's School. He was a photo reconnaissance pilot in Malta, and very, very successful. He was a bit of difficult to say what to describe him, but he did his own thing. He didn't like discipline. He wouldn't wear uniform properly. He would go off and do very unconventional things, but he was very, very successful and really helped Malta survive during the siege during 1940 to 42, flying out, doing reconnaissance over the Axis bases in the whole of the Mediterranean area. Sadly, he was lost in Germany later in the war. So some famous people came from Oxfordshire and came into it. Churchill flew out of Stanton Harcourt to the Casablanca conference, and he also flew in and out of other bases. And he was obviously always seen around the country, but he flew specifically from that base for that conference in 43. And the American bases, which were the smaller, more less permanent type bases, which is where the glider aircraft took off from for D-Day. They were visited not only by Dwight Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander for D-Day, but by many other of the high-ranking American officers to wish them well and to encourage them before D-Day. Of course, nobody knew when D-Day was going to be, but there was a huge build-up. I'll come on to the D-Day launches in a moment. The other thing which happened in 2 bases in Oxfordshire were secret trials of our very, very first jet aircraft, the E-28/39, E for experimental, the 28th project, and it was originally ordered in 1939. They first test flew from Brockworth in Gloucestershire, where it was built in May 1941. It was then sent across to Cranwell. There were 2 of these prototypes. It has P on, which shows it's a prototype. The very, very first jet, the Whittle jet engine. But they also took one of them to Edge Hill, and it operated out of Edge Hill for about 6 months, doing all sorts of trials, trying different engines, and then it moved on to Barford St John, both these bases being in Oxfordshire to the north, both being in relatively quiet locations and very secret. So these aircraft could fly around with very, very few eyes seeing them. Quite a claim for Oxfordshire. Moving on to Benson, this became a very, very important base and remains so. one of its, well, the most important thing during World War II, after the bomber squadrons had left to go to France and then come back to reform, it became the centre of photo reconnaissance. Started off by flying Spitfires. This is a late Mark on the top, Mark 19. And then as the Mosquito came into service, they also operated Mosquitoes. The Spitfire had cameras fitted underneath the wings, but also you see a hole there just to the right of the W, and that was an oblique camera fitted in the fuselage. Of course, the Spitfire was a single-engined aircraft. You'll see there's no guns on the wings. They polish the aircraft to get maximum height and maximum speed. And the Mosquito was a crew of 2. It had a much greater range, and it was just as fast as a Spitfire. And so having a crew of 2, it meant that the crew could be feeling confident about the targets they were seeking. And they were sent out every single day. There were 4 squadrons at Benson, and they would be given a target, and they would fly as single individual aircraft. They had terrible problems with weather over Europe, but they came back with photographs. They would go to alternative sites if they couldn't actually photograph the one they were initially sent out to see. Their motto was alone, unarmed, but unafraid, because they flew alone. They were totally unarmed. They were relying on their speed and their vigilance to see any aircraft around them. When the Mosquito first came into service, it was the fastest aircraft in existence, and it could out-accelerate and had a better speed than any of the German aircraft. But we did lose them. Some were shot down, and some just failed to come back, and we have no idea why. Benson and the American base was Mount Farm, which was just to the north of it, near Dorchester. That was the centre. But so that these aircraft could roam far and wide, I had 2 dispersals, one up at Wickham, the other one at St Evell down in Cornwall, at the extremities of the country. So from Wickham, they could fly up to the very north of Norway, and from St Evell at the south there, they could roam right down across Europe, down to Bordeaux and places like that. They could even look out for convoys, but what they were looking for was anything on the ground at all. Troop concentrations, what was going on in the docks, what was going on at the airfields, what was going on in factories. It was the eyes from the sky, and they reckoned that the work which was done by photo reconnaissance was as important as the code breaking at Bletchley Park. All the information they gathered was taken to Medmenham and also later Sutton Courtenay, Medmenham just being outside the county between Henley and Marlow. Well, here we have the photographic interpretation unit, and that was where the films which they took, they were black and white stills. Black and white was much more clear than colour, which was still in its infancy. And the Americans were operating out of Mount Farm, the British out of Benson. Also, Benson, one of the squadrons, 544 Squadron, was tasked to fly a daily flight to Moscow when Churchill was out there meeting with Stalin. And that was 2.5 weeks. Every single morning, one Mosquito had to fly non-stop to Moscow with the diplomatic bag and come back with the bags and the information and mail from the delegation, which was in Moscow. A fascinating project called Operational Frugal. Mount Farm was literally a farm, as you can see from the bottom picture. There's a P5 aircraft there, which is the photographic version of the P-38 Lockheed Lightning. And the Americans took the Spitfire, and you can see them with the American markings, because they were so efficient and so perfect for photo reconnaissance. And also they had the same fit that the British aircraft had. And the sort of things they would take, it's a vertical shot of Cologne on the left-hand side in April 44, showing the bombing. So they would send a photo reconnaissance aircraft out immediately after a bombing, immediately after the dams raid, so they could judge how effective it was. The one on the right is the Bismarck, this is the Bismarck down here, in a Norwegian fjord on a clear day. And they spent weeks trying to find the Bismarck, and they couldn't because of cloud cover. And eventually, and the date is there, 21st of May, 1941, it was found and subsequently tracked and subsequently sunk. So photo reconnaissance out of Benson, absolutely vital. D-Day. David mentioned this in his initial briefing. On D-Day, 4 major bases took part in the Normandy landings by towing gliders. It was Brize Norton, Broadwell, Harwell, and Grove. The gliders on the right-hand picture, they're not damaged or broken, they're actually assembling them. They came in bits, in crates. They had to assemble them on the airfield. You can see dozens in the distance there, which are ready. And they were towed by all sorts of different types of aircraft. This is a C-47 Dakota towing one. They would be towed by twin or 4-engined aircraft. They were quite heavy when they had a load of troops in. They could carry a jeep, or they could carry guns. But on D-Day, or in fact before D-Day, they took off in the dark so that they could be over the Normandy beaches at dawn. And of course, Pegasus Bridge, I think this picture at the bottom here is possibly one of those which landed by Pegasus Bridge to take it before the Germans had a clue what was happening. And they managed to secure the bridge before it was blown up by the Germans. And that allowed the troops, once they had landed on the D-Day beaches, to move easily across the canals, of which there were plenty in that area. It wasn't just for D-Day. These bases continued to send gliders out with all sorts of equipment for various operations, including Arnhem, Operation Market Garden, which was the failure. But so these bases were really, really busy. The markings are black and white stripes, what we call invasion markings. This was to prevent friendly fire. Every aircraft was marked on the wings, both the top and the bottom of the wings and around the fuselage. They were not marked up until the day before D-Day, hence the lines aren't that straight. But it was to make it very, very obvious these are friendly aircraft to us and not to be shot down. So Oxfordshire, major part in D-Day and later operations. It was also a hotbed for rumours. And one of them is an interesting one, which has never been substantiated, but it relates to Lancasters. And it relates to 6 black Lancasters at Enstone. Enstone is really on the road between Chipping Norton and Woodstock, and still an active airfield civilian. There is a rumour, and it's only a rumour, that 6 of these aircraft were painted black, and they operated from the far side of the airfield, away from the major area and hangars, and that they were trialling carrying the American atomic bomb, because when the bomb was being constructed, the American aircraft, no American bomber had a bomb bay as big as a Lancaster. And the rumor is, and it's only a rumor, that they could fit the atomic bomb into the fuselage of a Lancaster. It has been hotly disputed. No one can prove it, but it's something which just keeps coming round and round again, and it relates to an airfield in the middle of Oxfordshire. Now, a lot of people died in Oxfordshire, and a lot of good work was done, as well as the sad death side of things. But there are a number of memorials around the county which you can go and see. Port Meadow, which is really the most important one, has 2. There's one on the road just close to what was the airfield, which commemorates 2 airmen who were killed in a crash there. And this one on the airfield itself, which is now a public meadow, was unveiled in May 2018, and it's a permanent memorial to the people who served on the base. Mount Farm has one as well. It's a propeller from a P-38 Lightning aircraft. So it's the type which actually served there. And that's a permanent memorial to the Americans who served there. Stanton Harcourt, which is near Brize Norton and was a satellite to Brize Norton for a while, is where 6 workmen were killed during a strafing attack by the Germans when they attacked Brize Norton on the same day. This is a memorial to everybody who was killed when they flew from Stanton Harcourt. And it was unveiled very recently, you'll see in July 2021, by the commanding officer of Brize Norton, who is this lady here. She did the unveiling. They also buried a time tube as well. Edge Hill, which is commemorating the very early jet flight, has a plaque, top left, which is there on permanent display, and a little stone edifice as well, commemorating to the airfield. There are others in the county, but that gives a good idea of what exists and how the effort is being made not to forget what went on in the county during World War II. Now, the Navy, Oxford, of course, is a long way from the sea, but the Fleet Air Arm did have one base, and that was Culham. It was, in fact, probably the very last airfield to be constructed during World War II. It was only built in 1944, and initially it was built for the RAF because Navy airfields had 4 runways, and Culham only has 3, although it's narrow. And the reason they normally have 4 was because obviously aircraft on ships, the ship is pointing towards the wind. So they're taking off and landing into wind. So to give them the best opportunity of training that way, they give them 4 runways, but they're narrower than the RAF ones. An RAF runway is 150 feet wide. These were never more than 100 feet wide. But it's Royal Naval Air Station Culham. This map is 1944. It stayed open until 1953, when they started getting jet aircraft, and they didn't extend the runways. They moved the aircraft across to Benson, which had runways long enough, but they kept the station as a Navy station until 1957. It was a reserve station, and they closed it down then, and now it's the UK National Laboratory for Research. Employs a lot of people, does a lot of important work. It was known as HMS Hornbill, and it really saw very little service during World War II. So at the end of World War II, there was a huge rundown of the Air Force and the military generally. And again, I'm not sure how clear you can see on this map, but you'll see I've crossed out a whole pile of different airfields, which were closed almost immediately at the end of the war. So we're left coming from the north with Enstone, which stayed open for a short period as a satellite and is now a civil airfield, a small civil airfield. Upper Hayford remained, Bicester remained, Weston-on-the-Green remained for a short period of time and is still in RAF or military hands. Kedlington had various uses, University Air Squadron from Oxford, and is now, of course, an airport. Abingdon stayed open for a long, long time, and Benson is still open. Watchfield, just here on the edge of the county, that was open for a while as well. But Watchfield was an air traffic control school and closed in 1950 when it moved up to Shawbury in Shropshire. And the other one is Chalgrove over here, which is now Watlington, and that is now a Martin Baker airfield, or the Martin Baker airfield. And that has remained open and is operated by Martin Baker, who are well known for developing the ejector seat. And they have 2 of these Meteors where the back part of the rear part of the cockpit has the hood removed, and they put ejector seats in it, and the aircraft will fly, and they will do live ejections. They also have a huge ramp, which they can do ejections up as well. The seats, as you can see from the middle photograph, are very complicated. And the one on the right is not a Martin Baker shot, but I've put it in because it's so dramatic, showing a pilot ejecting from an aircraft over an air show in America. If you bear in mind, they had to develop a seat for aircraft like the Harrier, because the Harrier, being vertical takeoff, if it had total engine failure, it would be dropping out of the sky like a stone. So the seat had to counteract not only the downward motion, but had to get the pilot high enough to be able to allow the canopy to open. Martin Baker still operates Chalgrove. It's under threat. Homes England want to put about 4,000 houses on it, but there's a huge argument about it because the infrastructure in the area is totally inadequate, and also Martin Baker have a long lease on it, and they certainly don't want to leave. Moving on, other post-war, Abingdon became a major transport hub, and they built this massive great hangar for Beverley aircraft. It also took part in the Berlin airlift and the Avro York, bottom right. Squadrons from here and other bases took part in the airlift between 1948 and 1949, when Berlin was being supported solely from the air by the British and the Americans. It operated all sorts of different types of transport aircraft, not so much the Argosy on the top, more the Beverley, which was the earlier version, slower but bigger than the Argosy. It was also important in 1968, 1978, the 50th anniversary of the RAF. And this is the lineup of the aircraft for the Queen to view at Abingdon for the review, the 50th anniversary review. Also, for many years, VC-10s were lined up at Abingdon, and they were ex-British Airways machines, which were being taken by the RAF and converted into tankers. So Abingdon stayed open until December 1992, when it finally closed. The big hangar was used for maintaining all sorts of aircraft, including jets, such as the Jaguar. It's now Dalton Barracks. It's Army, but the future is doubtful, and we're not quite sure how long it's going to remain as an active military base. Moving on, Bicester was developed, became a maintenance unit and a major gliding base. It was closed by the RAF in March 1976, and it has been very important as far as gliding has been concerned, both military and then later now by civilians. But in 1978, it was taken over by Upper Heyford as a satellite base for storage and partially converted into a hospital in case of nuclear war. And some of the hangars here and several other bases around the country became what they call a cold base hospital. But all the equipment was in, there was just no people there. The people would be ferried in from the States. So right now, you can see the number of trailers and aircraft on the airfield. It's still used as a light aviation airfield. It is listed, the buildings are all protected on both sides of the road, and many of the original barracks have been converted into very interesting flats that have been sold to the public. Cold War. Oxfordshire played a major part in the Cold War for many years. Upper Heyford and Brize Norton. So moving first into Brize Norton, it obviously attracted the CND as it did particularly Grinham Common, which we hear more about, but Fairford, Grinham Common, Upper Heyford and Brize Norton were massively developed in the very early 50s to be able to accommodate American aircraft, which formed the deterrent as the deterrent against Soviets at the beginning of the Cold War. It saw a massive, this is Upper Heyford. The runway was extended to nearly 10,000 feet, and with the overruns at each end, it was 10,000 feet. There are 50 hardened aircraft shelters on it, which are concrete shelters designed to take a near miss from a bomb. It had a huge dependence and accommodation area, had a hospital, and a lot of hardened buildings. It was designed to take a lot of punishment if there had been attacks from the air. The whole of that, everything you can see on that is Upper Heyford. It's only part of it. It doesn't show the bomb dumps. It just shows the main hangars. The first two here, which were built in the very early 30s, and then the four bigger ones, which were built later, and then so many new buildings, because to support the bombers here, they just needed so much support. First of all, they had the strategic bombers, the large B-36s, and then the B-47s, and then they moved on to the F-111, which probably most people remember, the swing wing bomber, and they operated there for a long time. They took part in Operation El Dorado Canyon in April 1986, which was the attack on Libya, Gaddafi's Libya, and 5 aircraft from here, which are what we call Ravens. They are electronic aircraft, which the idea was to suppress enemy missiles, bombing, etc. And they flew with the aircraft from Lakenheath in Suffolk to bomb the Gaddafi bases. So it did actually see action. Upper Heyford closed, sadly, in 1993. It was put up for sale. Here are the details for the sale. And it's been sold, and now it's Heyford Park. And there is a museum there, which is very good. And they have tried to keep some of the names, but the airfield is slowly being swallowed up and developed with new housing. Brize Norton was also an important base. And I got one little video to show about the Duke of Edinburgh arriving at Brize Norton. It shows the base as it was in the early 50s. It starts off with him at Burton Wood up in Warrington, but then it quickly moves on to Brize Norton.
The Duke of Edinburgh receives a warm welcome from the children of Burton Wood when he makes a tour of American Air Force stations in Britain. All the honours of a 5-star American general are accorded the Duke, who wears his newly won RAF wings on his tunic. After a tour of the station, the Duke leaves Lancashire and flies on to Brize Norton in Oxfordshire, where again a full guard of honour is drawn up. General Seltzer greets the Duke before showing him round the airfield. A B-36, the largest operational aircraft in production, and its crew come in for special attention from the Duke. Here's the C-124, a huge cargo and troop carrier. The way out of the aircraft is by lift. Before the Duke leaves Brize Norton for London, a great fly-past is staged. A B-36 leads the air parade. Now comes a flight of Washington, some of the biggest aircraft in America's war armory.
Stirring stuff indeed from Pathé. Thank you, Pathé. Now, before the F-111s arrived, the Americans were operating RB-47s, which were, generally they look like the picture at the bottom here. We've had a crew 2 or 3 only and a large bomb bay. Well, these aircraft were reconnaissance and spy aircraft, and they had 4 crew in the bomb bay, a large bomb bay, a very unpleasant location, but it was absolutely packed full of electronic equipment. And their role was to fly from Brize Norton around the edge of the Soviet Union. The red line shows them going up to the Kola Peninsula, where their submarines operated from, and then further to the Russian out places. And en route, they'd be looking for Russian shipping, Soviet shipping. And then the blue shows as close as they could get to the Soviet Union. Of course, Eastern Europe then was part of the Soviet Union, so they couldn't get closer in. But they were listening for, or eavesdropping, for any form of information they could pick up. Sometimes they did things they shouldn't do. And in May 1954, one left Brize Norton. It went up and did the normal route up the outside of Norway, and then it actually came over Murmansk, out to Archangel, where it was intercepted, and back into Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and back to England. It got away with it. But in July 1960, just 3 months after Gary Powers had been shot down, one of these aircraft from Brize Norton was shot down over Murmansk, over here, and 4 of the crew were killed. 2 of them survived. In fact, it was the 2 in the cockpit who had ejector seats who could get out, but the others couldn't. The Americans departed from Brize Norton and from Upper Heyford, but earlier from Brize Norton in April 1965. The reason they were there and then they moved nearer to the east coast was because they were scared of attack from the east, and they wanted to be in the center of the country. Then we had the missile defense with the blood-down missiles, so they moved into the big American bases like Mildenhall and Lakenheath, nearer to the coast. Brize Norton was taken over by the RAF, became a major transport hub. There's a Google map photograph of it as it is. It was a very major station. The top pictures of the earlier aircraft, which were there as transport aircraft, the Belfast BC-10, BC-10 operating both as a tanker and a transport aircraft, as was the TriStar, as is the Voyager now here. And the bottom 3 are aircraft which are there today. Hercules, the days are numbered there, but the Atlas and the Voyager are really moving on. As David said at the beginning, it was an aircraft from here, a Globemaster, which evacuated 823 people from Kabul. If you look at that, it flew those people out, one aircraft, 823 people. So it is now still one of the major bases in the UK. Brize Norton is very, very, very active indeed, as is Benson. we looked at the picture before. Benson, I'm rushing a bit now because I'm nearly there. Benson was, as I said, the early, very important photo reconnaissance base and remained so until 1953, when it was transferred across to Transport Command. In the meantime, immediately after the war, the King's Flight, which then became the Queen's Flight on her accession, moved in to Benson on the 1st of May 1946, operating the letter type aircraft, two of those, and have Whirlwind helicopters early on. This is a Wessex later over Windsor Castle. They operated from there in a specific hangar to a very, very high standard. Those aircraft were always immaculate until April 1995, when the flight was disbanded and it became number 32 Royal Squadron at Northolt to the west of London. And the station continued to operate Andovers and Arguses for training and squadron use. It is now a major helicopter support base, having 60 squadrons flying Pumas, and is one of the two training bases for the Chinook. And the aircrew training facility, which I had the pleasure of spending a day in recently, is absolutely incredible. It's a total simulator where they can simulate a battle with 6 different aircraft and simulate Russian aircraft or any enemy aircraft or ground attack, ground missiles, to create a complete war scenario. It's absolutely amazing. Benson is active and is very much one of the 2 major bases still operating within Oxfordshire. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is a brief summary of Oxfordshire. There were 3 other non-flying bases, which I haven't got time to go into. One was an armament base at Aynsham. Nunham Park was used also for photo reconnaissance work, and Bampton Castle was an important signal unit. So I will stop at that, David, and hand back to you. And I hope it's given a good overtaste of the importance of Oxfordshire for aviation.
Well done. Thank you very much indeed. Aldon, an absolute tour de force. I have no idea that you were going to cover such a range of activity and stations in the county. During your talk, while you have a sip of water to recover your equilibrium, which you well deserved, we've had a few emails in from Hedda. I don't know Hedda, but the first one was that she was really enjoying this. And the second one, Hedda said, such a rich history in Oxfordshire. And maybe we'll come back to that during questions, because it is a question, I think, about how we mark these places, how we mark them on the ground today and tell their stories, because it is a very rich history and there are precious few information boards and that kind of thing around in some of these astonishing bases. However, let's get into the questions now, because we've got some coming in. One early one from Henry Spielberg, who's one of our trustees, Aldon, is to pick up on the atomic or nuclear weapons issue, which you touched on when talking about Bryce and Upper Hayford. Were these weapons ever stored in the county?
I cannot answer that 100% accurately, in that the Americans would never, neither the British, actually confirm or deny, but there were facilities at Upper Hayford for special weapons, and special weapons were nuclear. So at some points of time, it's undoubted there were nuclear weapons stored there. Bryce Norton, I'm not quite so sure about, because it was more reconnaissance and it was handed back to the British earlier. But I would guess with 90% probability, most likely at Upper Hayford, yes.
Aldon, can you close your own screen now? Clive's asked me to tell you that, so that's more like it. That's better.
Right.
Okay, now we've got you, and that's perfect. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Okay. Of course, with the nuclear issue, we all remember the protests outside the gate at Greenham Common. Did we see any of that at in Oxfordshire?
Yes, yes, all the bases saw it. Nothing like the extent of Greenham Common, because it was, they were there longer than they were at Hayford, potentially with nuclear weapons. But yes, there was demonstrations. There were demonstrations at all the American bases where they could possibly, and many were, there was no way they would have nuclear weapons. Some of them were boycotted like that, or blocked by the women. But yes, the answer is yes, but not as severely as Greenham.
On this issue of the nuclear weapons, we've got a point really from Richard Cooksey, who visited a facility at Bentwaters, the old USAAF base, and they still won't confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons there.
Correct.
At any stage. Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a question here from Penelope Marcus, just come in, Aldon. Can I ask you about my father in the United States Air Force 359 Fighter Group, based at East Wreatham, and crashed a plane at Kidlington on the 31st of March 1944. This is getting a bit detailed.
Oh, golly.
And it may require some research, I guess.
Yes, it is possible to find out about it. Every base has a diary, a formal diary. So Kidlington will have a squadron diary. He was American.
Yes, USAF 359 Fighter Group.
Right, so there will be records in the States, but that's a wartime unit, I think. And there was a major fire in the archives many, many years ago at Maxwell Air Force Base in the States, and a lot of personnel records were lost. If she can contact me via you, I would be happy to pursue that and find out if we can find out anything from the location of the crash, what happened and what sort of aircraft it was. And I have contacts I can put her in touch with who will track down in the States the crash. So yes, we can definitely help.
Okay, well that sounds interesting. I wonder where you are, Penelope. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a bit more as the evening goes on. Otherwise, contact Aldon through us, and we'll pass your detailed question on.
Sure.
Aldon, another question here from Duncan Parsons about the importance of Port Meadow, which is obviously the first base, and you'd think they would hang on to that first base. Why wasn't it developed and expanded later on?
I can only guess that it was close to the river, liable to flooding. It was close to Oxford, which was expanding, and potentially that public open space could have been built on, but certainly the surrounding area was developed. So, and it was literally public open space. And I think the public would have created pretty badly if they had fenced it off in peacetime and said you can't use it. It's like Greenbelt or common land. And I'm only guessing, but the buildings were temporary, and all those temporary bases were closed at the end of the war. And they do like to build airfields in the countryside. And you would have noticed all the others located with nothing around them. So there was room for expansion, minimum noise, and minimum danger from accidents and that sort of thing. So put all that together, and I can see Port Meadow probably wasn't going to be suitable.
No, and of course they wouldn't want it so close to a place like Oxford, a historic centre and so on. I'm sure they would want to get it away from there. Thank you for them very much for that. A question here about photographic reconnaissance, which you mentioned significantly when you were talking about Royal Air Force Benson, Aldon. Can you say how important you think the PR, the photographic reconnaissance and interpretation as undertaken at Benson, Mount Farm and Medmenham was in and after World War II? There may well be another story in all this, which you might want to come back and tell us another day.
I think there is. I have a full lecture on the same subject already. It was vitally important. There were getting on for 2,000 people working on photographic interpretation. and they specialised. Also, the majority of the people doing it were women, because they found women were more patient and more comprehensive in their search. They would not give up. If they could not track something and they couldn't understand something, they would work at it until they got the answer. Whereas a lot of men, hate to say this, but probably wouldn't. They would move on to something else. So they had, as the war developed and we got more and more expertise, they had people who specialised in airfields, aircraft types, dockyards, all sorts of things. And in fact, there's a story about one lady who had been following a German circus, and they'd been photographing. Somehow it had come up in some photographs in an area. And one day a baby elephant had been born in this circus. And she suddenly went running around the room shouting, "There's a baby elephant, there's a baby elephant." And she had spotted this on a photo reconnaissance photograph in the middle of Germany during the war. And this is the sort of detail they were going into. And they were aware of everything the Germans were doing. And one of the most important research places they were working on was Peenemünde, which was where they developed the V weapons. And that was found by the photo reconnaissance pilots and subsequently just blasted out of existence by the bombers. Also, things like the Bismarck. The Bismarck, Churchill was scared stiff of the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, because if they went out free range with their support ships, they could totally wipe out the convoys because their guns had a much greater range than any of ours, and they were faster. And so they were absolutely desperate to contain them, but they needed to know where they were. And initially, the Tirpitz was so far up in northern Norway, the aircraft could hardly get there. And if they could get there, they couldn't linger searching for them. So they were, I mean, working through various logbooks. Mick, who runs the museum, Rick Prendergast at Benson, has some amazing material in there. And looking through the logbooks, they give you the targets which the individual pilots were asked to go and photograph, and given the alternatives if it was bad weather. And sometimes they go down to very, very low level. And in fact, on one occasion, I'll keep this as short as I can, one of them was coming back from Europe, he was coming over the coast, and he looked down and he saw something very strange on the cliff on the coast. So he went down very, very low and took an oblique photograph of it. And it was a radar unit, the German radar looking across towards Britain. As a result of that, the British decided they had to have it. So they sent a raiding party in a submarine. No, they got parachutists who took the base. There were only a few Germans there. They just took them by surprise. They dismantled the thing. They put it into dinghies. There was a submarine waiting for them. They took the whole thing away. And that was all as a result of the photo reconnaissance pilot. The work they did was absolutely incredible. And many of them sadly died during it.
Yeah. That's a very comprehensive answer, and but it may just be the tip of the iceberg of what's yet to come from you, Aldon, on that, because it does sound a fascinating tale. I remember the name Constance Babington Smith as being a significant figure in all this, and I mention her because her nephew Hugh Babington Smith was the project officer for this museum, the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock. He lives in Austria now.
That's amazing. What a link.
But he was always very proud of his aunt, Constance. Have you got anything to say about Constance?
She was quite a lady. Yes, before the war, she worked for Vogue magazine, and she was a very attractive lady. And I have a photograph, and when I first saw her, she was wearing a hat. And I thought there was a Spitfire circling behind her. And then I realized the Spitfire was a little tiny model on the hat, actually, on the hat. Anyhow, she was a lady at Medmenham who first discovered the V1. It was a pilotless bomb with very, very short wings. They had seen it probably 6 months before in photographs. They did not know what it was. But by diligent research, being a lady, she was the first one credited in saying, this is an aeroplane, this is a flying bomb. And it was really as a result of that one of the bombing raids was going to take place. She led a section in Medmenham. She was a very powerful lady. And towards the end of the war, she went to the States. The States asked if she could go and help them over there. She moved over there for a while. And because of the wonderful work she did, she was given the American Legion of Honor award, one of the very few Brits, and certainly one of the very few ladies who actually got it. So she was a real character and a great name, and a very important person in photo reconnaissance.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. I shall be pressuring my chairman at our next board meeting that we should tell the story of Constance Babbington Smith in the museum. It sounds a great one.
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt your questions for a second now, or the questions to you, Aldon, just to say to people that I hope you're enjoying the evening tonight, that you found this a fascinating talk, as I certainly have. Please don't forget the donation button. This is most important for us. We are entirely funded by your donations and by everything that we raise. We have no other funding coming our way. So we really depend upon your generosity. We hope that you're very much enjoying this, and we hope that you appreciate that we've come into your living room tonight to deliver this before your supper or your second gin and tonic, and we very much hope that you're enjoying it to the extent that you'll feel inclined to donate tonight. Many thanks for that. Back to questions. The next one, I've got one here. This is a sort of rather detailed one. Aldon, I hope you can still hear me. I can't see you at the moment.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay.
I'll try.
This is from Mike. And he says, do you know Vale Farm between Blenheim and Ditchley?
Sorry, it died a second then. I heard from Mike.
Yes. He's asking about a satellite strip.
Yes.
At Starville Farm. I think it's Starville.
Yes.
Blenheim and Ditchley.
Yes, that's right. There were 4 of the satellite landing grounds in the county. I just didn't dare cover them because I would just keep talking.
Yeah.
Basically, what they were areas, sometimes in a park, sometimes a large farm, where aircraft could be stored before they were worked on, or if they were surplus. Often there'd be trees, and they could hide them in hides in the trees, and it would just be a grass strip long enough for them to land and take off on. And then they would have very few permanent people there, just have a maintenance party to support them. And the aircraft would be put there for as long as was necessary before they were called back to the main unit. And so places like Bright Norton and Vista used 4 different places, and they were named after farms. There was one at Weston Park in Shropshire, near to the Air Force Museum up there at Cosford. There was one at Knowsley Park, which is now Safari Park in Liverpool. There was one just outside Manchester, which was used for dropping paratroopers on as for trial. They were all satellite landing grounds. And one of them, in fact, in Shropshire, they flew Wellingtons into it, and they were so short of propellers that they'd land the aircraft in there, take the propeller off, take it by road back to the permanent base, which was Burton Wood, put it onto another aircraft and fly that in to the landing ground. And you'd end up with a load of aircraft there with no propellers, but they were there and available if they were needed. So yes, there were 4 in Oxfordshire. Altogether around the country, there must have been about 60 of them.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Jay Lieberman, United States Navy. I'm sure, Jay, you've asked questions of us before.
I know Jay. Good old Jay. I'm glad he joined us.
Very good. It's not so much a question. It's more the point that photo interpretation is still a very important part of today's military. Both MOD and US forces, satellite and plane imagery are used today.
Absolutely. If you see what's going on right now in
Ukraine, for example.
In Ukraine, if you look at Flight Radar 24, you will see British and or American aircraft over the Black Sea, circling, listening, they're up at 50,000 feet, listening to everything that's going on across the area of conflict. Yeah. And you'll also see them up in the Baltic as well, where the threat was there with the Baltic countries, which seems to have drifted away at the moment because Putin's too busy elsewhere. But it is absolutely vital. Satellite communication is taken over to a very large extent, but it's very interesting we still have U-2s, because to a point we still need something closer to the ground on occasions. But satellite communication, we are getting real time right now at this minute. They can pick up things that are going on in the ground on the ground, shall I say, in China, in Russia, in Ukraine. Absolutely vital.
Thank you for that. I've got an observation really from Paula F. It's not a question, but she said, no question, but huge thanks to you, Aldon, for the Benson history from a Benson baby, which is what obviously she was. It's a great talk. So thank you very much for that. And an observation also, this is a question from Richard Cooksey this time. Were the United States bases, and you mentioned several of them, classed as Royal Air Force bases during the Second World War, or was this a Cold War matter, a Cold War technical sort of description that they used, even though they had RAF personnel there?
Certainly in the Cold War period, they were all RAF stations, whether they were Army, Air Force or Navy, they were all RAF. During the war, they weren't called by the RAF name the same. Technically, they were owned by the RAF. Technically, the King was the landlord, but they were known more as their American AAF numbers, Army Air Force numbers. But Upper Heyford, for instance, after the war was RAF Upper Heyford.
Yeah.
And the American Army operated out of Burton Wood, and that was RAF Burton Wood. And they operated a fleet of boats out of Southampton Water, and that was RAF Hythe. So anything which foreign operators were in during that period of time was an RAF station. I think during World War II, not as much, very, very little.
Okay, thank you very much for that. One question here from Fiona about female pilots, actually, flying aircraft, delivery aircraft, really, from around England. They would have come into Oxfordshire quite a lot, I guess, particularly if they were flying aircraft out of somewhere where they'd been repaired in a place like Cowley.
Absolutely right. I'm sorry, I really should have included this because it is very important. The ATA, Air Transport Auxiliary, also known as Ancient and Tatty Airmen, or Anything to Anywhere, ATA, their headquarters was White Waltham, just to the west of Maidenhead. Yeah. And they had different bases. They had 13 of them scattered all around the country. And two of them in particular, and White Waltham was one of them, had a large number of lady pilots. And they did a fantastic job. There was one who used to live very close to me. I met her. She was a very fiery lady. Her name was Lettice Curtis. And she had flown everything from a Tiger Moth to a Lancaster. She was one of the few women who had got enough experience to fly a four-engined aircraft. And one quick story is when she or one of her friends, comrades, was landing, she landed the Lancaster at an airfield, and she climbed out, and the ground crew just stood round and did nothing. They just stood there and waited. And she said, "What are you waiting for?" And they said, "We're waiting for the pilot." She said, "I am the pilot." And they said, "Oh, come on, you're joking." And in the end, the flight sergeant sent one of the airmen up into the aircraft and said, "Go and get the pilot out." And of course, he came back and there was no pilot there. They were treated as a bit of a joke, but they were far from a joke. And one of the major things that the senior lady, Pauline Gower, managed to achieve was equal pay for the women. The women earned the same money as the men ferrying those aircraft. And they were all civilian. The men were either foreigners who were not allowed to fly militarily, or some of them had glasses. One of them had only one arm, but if they could fly, they allowed them to fly, but they couldn't have flown operationally. So there were hundreds and hundreds of pilots, and many women lost. Amy Johnson was one of them. She was lost in the Thames estuary. She was flying a plane from Prestwick, and she should have landed at Kidlington, which is another reason why I should have picked this up, and my apologies for not doing. She landed at Blackpool to refuel, and she ended up over the Thames estuary, and no one can understand why. And we believe she ran out of fuel over the Thames estuary. She crash landed. She was seen to crash land, and a ship went to her aid, but they could never find her, and she perished. And that was Amy Johnson, who was the first woman to fly to Australia. She was the first person to fly to Moscow in a day. She had a massive experience, and she should have been able to fly this plane to Kidlington, but failed. But yes, lady pilots were absolutely vital. They were not allowed to fly in the military, but they are now, and a lot of our pilots in the military are women.
Indeed. And there have been a number of recent books, haven't there, about these ladies,
Yes.
or biographies of these ladies, who have attracted a great deal of attention, and rightly so. Thank you very much for that. I think we should draw this to a close, Aldon, and let you off the hook. You've been on parade now for an hour and a half and done it beautifully, and thank you very much indeed. I would make one observation, really, which is to anybody who's interested in this. It occurred to me when looking at those maps of the county with all the air bases that you pointed out to us so comprehensively, Aldon, it occurred to me that, of course, in many of these places today, there is nothing to indicate what it was at the time of during the war or in earlier times of conflict. And if there is interest in this, if there are people who would like to research this and maybe come and talk to us at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum about working up some way of commemorating and getting some kind of commemorative boards erected in some of these places, which can be part of the history of the county. I think that might be a project for the future, and I hope it might appeal to people. So I'm going to pull things to a close now, Aldon, and with a few thanks, first of all. Clive Smith, thank you very much indeed. Clive is our cameraman, filmmaker, editor, and does all the technical stuff. And if you could see this room where I'm sitting now, and Clive is behind the whole thing, you'd be amazed, I can tell you. I'd like to thank Lucy Group very much indeed, Lucy Group Limited of Oxford, an famous engineering firm, for sponsoring the talk tonight, which is greatly appreciated because it allows us to keep donations that you make. And we're very grateful to you for your donations. Thank you very much indeed for supporting us tonight, for listening in, and for making your generous donations, which make such an enormous difference to us. Aldon Ferguson, you have been a tower of a man tonight. Thank you very much indeed for your talk tonight. We really enjoyed listening to it, and the detail has been simply astonishing, and I'm sure there are other stories which we can draw out from you if you can recover from delivering this one, for which we're very grateful.
No problem at all.
For this, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. I would like to present you with our stock present, which is a splendid history of the 52nd Regiment, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry 2nd Battalion in the Great War, Simon Harris's acclaimed history during the Second World War, only written in the late 90s, so long after the end of the First World War. But it's a beautifully written book, beautifully researched, wonderfully illustrated with splendid photographs, and it's, I think, a lesson for the way in which military history could be written a long time after the event. The internet makes so many more things available to us, and Simon Harris has produced a beautiful book here, which I'm sure you will greatly enjoy. It'll be in the post to you very shortly, Aldon, if you'll accept it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. It sounds excellent. I should be delighted, David. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I give everyone a look forward to our next talk? We're now into the autumn series for 2022-23. The next talk will be on the evening of Thursday, the 27th of October, when Alan Wakefield, a historian from the Imperial War Museum in London, will be giving us his talk on mountains, mules, and malaria, the British Salonika campaign 1915 to 18, and it's hair-raising stuff for what those people had to go through, those who are out there fighting in that rather forgotten campaign. 2 battalions of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry were committed there. They are our county regiment, and you'll hear their story on the 27th of August. In the meantime, thank you all again very much for listening in, and we'll look forward to next time. For the time being, good night.
Thank you. Good night from me too.